welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Conscious Chat. This is the Conscious Chicano. This is Conscious Chat 25, and the title is Decolonization. Welcome, everyone who's on my Instagram Live and YouTube Live. Um, wow, this is going to be a deep subject. Um, if you just came into my YouTube chat, let's see here. Let me get into my chat there. Um, Read below the details. Um, Go to my Rumble account and subscribe there. Like my videos. I have a lot of deep videos there uploaded. Go check them out. Just digest that stuff. I'll be uploading more coming soon. So go check that out. And if you want to contact me, click on my Instagram link, send me a message. You want some resources on this topic, let me know. Or if you want to be interviewed with me on my video here on my channel, or if you want me on your channel for an interview. But and also join me on my Twitter. Click on my Twitter. I'm doing now uncensored conscious chats there, and we go over some deep subjects there. Usually subjects that will get you banned on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. So, anyways, um, so the topic is decolonization. I've actually been researching and studying on decolonization philosophy for a long time. For a long time. So, um, I actually specialize in decolonization and, decolonizing philosophy, decolonizing theology, and a Chicano indigenous decolonizing um, philosophy and perspective as well, praxis, you know. Um, I just actually came across an article I just finished reading. It's called Decolonization as Metaphor. Go check that out. You can find it on Google. Go read it. Some interesting points there that I've actually came across. And man, that article, is good to some extent. I don't agree with everything in there, but overall, it's pretty good. Um, so it talks about settler colonialism, right? Uh, Decolonizing from settler colonialism, how it's different from your typical social justice movements out here, right? And it goes, for example, the whole Occupy movement, right? Or some of this social justice curriculums, in education, or some of the abolitionist movements, the civil rights movements. And it makes a distinction between decolonization from settler colonialism. And there's actually another good book too. A little book that I have is called Settlers, and I think you could find it even online. A free book. You could find a free. They have it for free on online. Just Google it. It's called Settlers, and I forgot the author's name, but you know, this decolonization is a deep and complex subject, and I have various views on it, and I'm still kind of like um, growing with that whole process of understanding what truly and absolutely is decolonization. And in my early days, you know, I thought, oh, I had an absolute idea, a vision in some sense, that decolonization means for indigenous people, to get their land back, right? There's this whole movement called land back, right? And basically sending all Europeans back to Europe, right? And indigenous brown people getting their land back, all the stolen land and resources, that was the vision. And it's kind of still my vision to some extent. But I see it's not realistic. And I actually came across another guy who's I guess he does like danza and stuff like that. He says that he doesn't believe in decolonization. What he believes is re-indigenizing, right? Or indigenizing. So he says decolonization is an impossible project. But I sometimes think that it's not really impossible. I mean, if you actually, know about Marcus Garvey, he kind of went on a project where he wanted African black people here to return to Africa because that was their motherland, right? And he was promoting black consciousness and you know um, liberation. But he said for Africans that this is, the motherland is Africa. So that's I'm pretty much in alignment with that, and I actually think that Europeans can do the same thing where they return to their motherland, Europe as well, So, and this is a big challenge because a lot of the say the 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 challenge is for Europeans, descendants of colonizers, is to what does decolonization mean for them, and what does decolonization mean for an indigenous person, a brown person, right? So, an indigenous person, brown person, decolonization for them absolutely means that, oh, land back, right? We want our resources, all our stolen wealth, all our land back, right? And what is the implications of that, right? Land is wealth, right? Land is wealth. This is one of the reasons why the first things that the Europeans did is they came and took the land, right? Because they knew it was wealth, right? It was resources, right? And this is why they had to come and commit genocide and exterminate the natives, right? Commit the worst Holocaust ever in history because they were after the resources and land. And they built their whole empire based on stolen land and resources and wealth, built on genocide, right? Built on the slavery of indigenous people, the genocide of indigenous people. And it gets very complex because even decolonization for natives is different from decolonization from Europeans, Africans, African Americans, natives. We all have a different vision on decolonization. And decolonization as a metaphor challenges, people who are foreigners to the Americas, right? Everyone, European, African American, even Asians, Middle Easterns, Jewish people, all of them, challenges all of them. And, basically um, holds them accountable for their status on stolen land, right? Whether they were brought here, whether they came here willingly or unwillingly, So we have to remember that this land belongs to indigenous people, right? They're the original peoples of the Americas. We can't forget that. So the implications. Just imagine if all the land was returned back to the indigenous people. What would that mean, right? That would mean indigenous brown people throughout the Americas would gain their true sovereignty, right? True sovereignty, where they wouldn't be under a foreign government, a colonial, Eurocentric, white supremacist government, right? Where they had the land and resources, a lot of things would change, right? There would be no more poverty for indigenous brown people, right? When I say brown people, we are indigenous Chicanos as well, you know. Um, and it's not the way I see it is I take it further than the article. The article is called Decolonization as Metaphor, right? And it's just talking about land back, but also I go further and challenging even the Europeans in Europe. Lots of stolen resources and wealth went to Europe to build their empires over there, their kingdoms, right? The Vatican, lots of stolen gold and wealth, extracted resources, all went throughout Europe and even throughout the globe. So, what does that mean? If we want our wealth back too, not just land, but we want even our stolen artifacts and regalia. There's some of those are in the museums of Europe, the Vatican. So they still have our stolen artifacts and some of our just cultural artifacts and even some of our codices and everything, right? So they still maintain that they have profited from the wealth of the Americas, right? So, a lot of times you hear African Americans promoting reparations, right? And there's even in California, Governor Newsom trying to pay off, descendants of African slaves, right? Um, you know, Especially in terms of, wealth, right? Like economics, like they want to pay them money. Well, there's even a problem with that because most of the land hold on, let me just alert people who just came in. I'm on YouTube. Definitely, I'm on YouTube right now. So, welcome everyone. I'm on YouTube and Instagram. Welcome. So, decolonization. If you just came into the Instagram and YouTube, I'm talking about decolonization. Okay, so the challenge of African Americans, they want reparations, right? And and so what's going to happen in their vision is that the European colonizers, the government, the colonial settler government, their goal is for to acquire what 30 acres and a mule in some sense. What does that mean? It means land, right? Um, and also this guy Gavin Newsom wants to give money to the descendants of African slaves. But some people oppose that and say, wait a minute, that's taxpayer money that you're going to be giving to African Americans, right? And why do why do people of color have to pay for that, right? Taxpayer money paying African Americans for what European colonizers did, right? So I have a problem with using my taxpayer money to pay off descendants of African slaves, because my descendants are the indigenous people here, right? And it gets very complex, right? Because there was at times Africans here in the United States who were enslaving indigenous people as well. And the reverse is true too. There were some natives enslaving African Americans, right? So it gets very complex. But the bigger issue right now is Europeans. They're going to be giving their stolen resources and land to people they enslaved, right? But it's originally native land, native resources, right? So ideally, I would think that Europeans would have to go back to Europe, right? Give up all the land and wealth back to the indigenous people, and then pay off those who they've colonized and enslaved, right? That means the indigenous people too, the brown people, right? And also pay off the African Americans. But from the indigenous decolonization perspective, Marcus Garvey was right. African Americans have their motherland, right? They have their motherland. There was a whole Go Back to Africa movement by Marcus Garvey. I think they were going to, what was it, Liberia or something like that. And there was some that actually went down there, right? So ideally, Europeans would go back to Europe and give back all the native land and resources, right? And pay off the indigenous people all their stolen, from all, pay them off for all the damage and stolen wealth, right? And if that's done, will there even be any leftover money to give to the African slaves too? After, say, they go back to Africa and you pay them off, right? There might be some wealth, but um, and and some of the foreigners that came here riding off the back of colonization, right? There's a lot of different Europeans. It wasn't just the Anglos and Spanish and Portuguese. It was also the French, the Italians, and even all the Europeans that came over here and profited off this land, even the so-called oppressed Europeans, right, who were first discriminated even amongst themselves, right? The Irish, the Jews, the Italians, right? Now you have new ones. Yeah, you got Armenians, you got Ukrainians. You know, they're all basically profiting off stolen land and wealth here, right? Some of them get political asylum. They get paid by the government to be here, right? A lot of these European nations, right? So, um, so that's the whole issue. That's very challenging from an indigenous perspective. Decolonization is hardcore, right? And it's not this no wannabe social justice and Occupy movement. What is the Occupy movement? See, that paper was good. Decolonization as metaphor, right? It challenges the whole Occupy movement. What is the Occupy movement all about, right? They claim that the 1% has most of the wealth and 99% don't, right? So their goal is to reallocate, right? all that land and resources back to the 99%. But then they say out of all that 99%, how much of the indigenous are there, right? Count it, right? So the Occupy movement is still settler colonialism, right? It sounds like social justice and revolutionary and this and that, but it's not. It's just actually settler colonial white liberals, basically, just recolonizing, right? It's almost like gentrification, right? Where you have whites out here who are hipsters, and a lot of them are liberals, right? But they're over here buying up the real estate in some of the poor communities, the brown communities out here, right? And they go and buy that, and then they go raise the rents, and they kick out all the brown people, right? And this is their takeover of some of the brown communities out here. That's exactly what the Occupy movement is about in terms of indigenous land and resources. So we have the 1% usually who are European descendants, right? But then out of the 99%, there's quite a lot of Europeans too who want the wealth and the resources, the stolen wealth and resources. So we even have to decolonize from the Occupy movement, right? And even that article is pretty good. It talks about even when whites try to say they're all about decolonization, they're not really they're not really trying to decolonize, right? It questions their whole agenda, right? They say they talk all this decolonization. They go and appropriate native culture, even try dressing like natives and living in the reservations and trying to do good stuff for the natives, right? Um, but they're still here on this land. They're still settler colonialists, right? They're still profiting from this land. They still have white privilege, right? And matter of fact, when they say when white people go on this decolonization agenda, it's just to basically purge them of white guilt, right? Oh, I'm one of you now, right? I'm like, okay, you're like now I'm here. I identify with your pain. I identify with your colonization. I know what you're going through, right? But they somehow are relieved, right, of their they're no longer held accountable, right? And they still remain on the land with their status, their white privilege. They still have they're succeeding, they're educated, usually in better positions than the rest of us brown folks out here, right? Indigenous folks, right? Um, and so they just they're still occupiers, right, on stolen land, right? And what are the implications though? So you know this whole decolonization, it challenges the social justice movements out here. You know, the white liberals out here, the so-called white revolutionaries, right? Like even when it comes to the whole abolitionists, right? Abolitionists, white abolitionists, still occupy, right? All they did was what? Free black slaves, right? But they still benefit from this land and resources. They still haven't given up the wealth and resources back to the native people, right? What about the civil rights movement, right? Well, the civil rights movement just, it stopped blatant racism to some extent, systemically, right? But white supremacy still exists to this very day, systemic. Actually, the civil rights movement stopped the blatant type discrimination and racism, even though it's still going on. Now we have a colorblind white supremacy, a systemic white supremacy. It still discriminates. You see all the inequalities going on. But even inequality is just a concept, right? There shouldn't even be inequality, right? Natives, brown people should have all this land and resources, right? You know, what I mean, equality, I mean, equality for white people here, it's still colonial, right? It's still, it means that they're still going to remain on this land, occupying this land, and still having, some kind of privilege and, benefiting from colonialism and stolen wealth. So even equality for white people is colonialism, right? So this article really gave me some insight. So the whole civil rights movement was just basically giving crumbs to native and brown people, right? It gave black people some freedoms, right? But even black people still face discrimination and racism, right? Welcome, casual conversation. I'm getting into a deep conversation on decolonization. If you just came in, it's also some insight based on an article on Google called "Decolonization as Metaphor," and it's a good paper challenging the social justice movements, the Occupy movements, the abolitionist movements. Uh, and what does decolonization truly mean for indigenous and brown people, basically? And it challenges the status of foreigners here on this land, right? Because all this land is indigenous. It's all brown people's ancestral land, right? And so you could see that the Europeans, African Americans, Middle Easterns, Asians, they're all foreigners to these lands, right? They all occupied this land, after colonization, right? So the original inhabitants of these lands have always been indigenous brown folks. So this whole decolonization challenges even the status of white folks. How even these white folks that claim they're all revolutionary, they're all about social justice and everything, and they even try to be native, right? Or they try to be Chicano or something. Um, you know, they claim they're all about liberation, but ultimately they're still settlers on stolen land. They still have privilege, right? They still have status. Usually, most of them, right? Um, and they're still occupiers, right? And they talk. They all they do is talk, right? But there's no action, right? You know, they don't want to go back to their motherland, Europe, right? They don't want to give up the resources and land, right? You know, that's too much for them, right? And that's a big challenge. That's a big challenge for them, right? So even when it comes to education, this whole that article talks about how even this whole social justice education, it's just metaphor, right? It's just talk, right? It's just it goes into Paulo Freire. Um, he what is it called? Pedagogy of the oppressed, right? And he talks about that. I mean, that article challenges even that the pedagogy of the oppressed, where it's just talking about education and kind of like turning the tables of, say, um, the master slave relationship, in some sense, where value is given to everyone, voice is given to everyone. It's not just like the teacher and student relationship, where the teacher has all the absolute knowledge and the student is just there as a repository, right? Like just see, just kind of absorbing all the knowledge, and there's still kind of some kind of hierarchy going on there, right? So he kind of challenges that and says, "Oh, well, we need to hear the voices of the masses instead, or the students, right? There's a give and take, right? There's a each one teach one in some sense, right? We can all learn from each other, right? But that article challenges pedagogy of the press because it says nothing about settler colonialism in some sense, where it doesn't challenge. It doesn't. I mean, it doesn't talk about native land, stolen land, true decolonization. So decolonization for indigenous brown folks, it challenges the abolitionists, the white liberals, the Occupy movement, this, the educational pedagogies out here that are built on social justice, the civil rights movement, all that stuff. They all come short to decolonization. And decolonization is very important because what are the implications there? Land is wealth, right? Like I said, the first thing that the colonizers did was came and took the land and the resources, and they went and they committed genocide. They kicked all the natives out, right? Killed them off, enslaved them, put them on a reservation, a little piece of land, right? This is their ghettos, right? Their barrios, right? They did the same thing with the Mexicans. The Anglos came and occupied, where Mexicans lived, right? Many of us Mexicans are native, right? Kicked them off their land and stole their wealth and all that. The Europeans got rich off the land and resources. They're still benefiting from that. Whereas the majority of our indigenous brown people out here are working class, barely making it, poor, you know, cooking for them, the Europeans in their restaurants, being their maids. Go to Beverly Hills, you'll see a lot of indigenous Central Mexican maids there, right? Working for rich white people. Um, where they're construction workers building their buildings, right? Laying their cement, right? We're the agricultural workers there, maintaining their agricultural system, right? We're even working in their corporations, right? We're usually the ones that are maintaining the infrastructure, right? While they're the CEOs profiting, benefiting from everything, right? So they're still settlers, right? And even when you have these white liberal revolutionaries, a lot of times they end up having status with nonprofits. They're the professors. They're the one with the PhDs, right? And they have their status still, right? And they're claiming they're all about liberation, but they're still here on this land occupying settler colonialism, right? So that article really said a lot of this stuff, you know, especially when Europeans they claim they're about social justice and they're all into decolonization and even try to act like they're down with the Chicanos and natives. They're still here. They're still on this land. They're still benefiting from what their ancestors did, stole the land and resources, right? I see that, you know. It's that's the reality, right? So this one indigenous dansante came out one time. He says he doesn't believe in decolonization. He says it's not realistic, right? Obviously, we have the issue of white people, right? There was actually a Native American guy says, "Oh, we still got to live with these whites here," you know. Basically, we're stuck with them, right? These European colonizers. And realistically, the Europeans will not go back to Europe, right? Their motherland. You know, they create this fake patriotism and this whole story of how this is their land, right? And and supposedly they died for this land, right? Fought wars and this and that. No, they fought other Europeans over this land, right? The original inhabitants were here, and this was their land, right? It's still their ancestral land, right? But are white people ever going to go to Europe? Seems like realistically they don't want to, right? They don't want to give up the land and resources and their privilege, right? All they do is just talk, 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 talk. All this liberation and all that. While the masses of brown indigenous people are still poor and they're still working class, building up the Europeans' empires, right? Their infrastructure, right? We still got a government controlled by white people, right? Just look at Congress. The majority of people in Congress are all white, right? A few token people of color, right? Few brownies, right? Brown noses, as they call them, right? Um, and so this is the reality, you know. So the guy said, "Oh, I don't believe," the danza guy said, "I don't believe in decolonization. I believe in re-indigenization or indigenizing." So that actually seems very realistic, but there's even a problem with that. So we already have a colonial white supremacist structure going on, right? An economic white supremacist structure that benefits those who own the, the CEOs, those who own, what's it called, the means of production, right? The owners are usually of European descent. You have a few token brown or people of color, but exceptions don't make the rule, right? Usually the European colonizers and their descendants own this the wealth and resources. And so the problem is that we have a lot of brown people here, but they don't have power and ownership over a lot of their resources, right? And even Malcolm X highlighted what was going on in Africa, right? He goes, "Why do you have so many black people and so very few white people in Africa? But yet these few white people control everything. They control the resources, they control the land, they control the institutions, everything." And he made a good point. Even if we get all, say our population, the United States, the browning of the nation is inevitable. This is why white people don't want immigrants coming here, especially brown immigrants, right? Because they know, it's going to increase the brown populations, right? That's just why they're all into this whole eugenics thing, with the colonizer juice and sterilization and all that, right? Um, this is why immigration is such a big thing for them, right? And both for the liberals and the Republicans, right? Um, but they see us as a threat, right? The browning of the nation is inevitable. We're going to have more brown people in the United States eventually, right? As the dominant ethnicity in some sense. And white people are not reproducing as much, right? And so their population is declining, right? Their population is declining. So the issue is though is exactly what Malcolm X was talking about. The issue is that we may have a lot of brown folks, populating in the United States, but the problem is we still have these white people who are in power, only owning all the resources, controlling the institutions, right? Controlling the government, right? This is the problem out here, right? This is what white supremacy is all about, right? And so we, in a sense, you know, as brown folks, we have a system already here that's in favor of the Eurocentrics of the Europeans, right? So the challenge is what George Orwell even talked about, where in Animal Farm, right? You had the humans oppressing the animals, right? And so the animals rise up against the humans, right? Who are enslaving them, right? And so the animals, there's like revolutionaries. They end up stirring them up, right? And they rebel against the humans and become free, right? But then once they become free, then there's a problem though. The revolutionary leaders now become the oppressors and start oppressing their own people, right? So the oppressed become the oppressors, right? And that's part of the problem too. And say that brown folks, eventually Europeans die out, or some of them say idealistically they go back to their motherland, right? And we have the majority of brown folks here, right? But we still have this infrastructure, this system of white supremacy, Eurocentrism, right? We have that problem there. So even though brown people may, repopulate and maybe gain some of their, resources and land back through, purchasing real estate, but you still have a government ultimately owning all the land, right? Even if you own your own real estate, I found this out. It all still belongs to the U.S. government, right? In a colonizer, white supremacist government, right? And we still have these Europeans that set up their institutions of Eurocentrism, right? So the challenge is: should we change the system and the institutions, or should we get rid of them and build our own institutions, right? That's the challenge right there, right? I kind of call it the white supremacist matrix, right? The challenge is, the revolutionaries, they want to destroy the system, but then, people are depending on the system for livelihood. That means a lot of people are, if you destroy the system, it's gonna there's gonna be people who are gonna starve, right? And they lose their access to resources, right? Because they're so dependent on the corrupt system, the white supremacist matrix, right? And so, and realistically, that's not going to happen, right? That I realize that a lot of revolutionaries, they have in their own mind that, oh, we're going to destroy the system. No, you're not. This country has one of the biggest militaries around, right? Nuclear arms, highly sophisticated weaponry, right? You're not going to destroy the system, right? Because the system has a lot of weaponry to defend itself. So that's not realistic. And you're not going to get rid of, a lot of things out here, right? And so what is the other alternative, right? Do you change the system? Do you milk the system and manipulate it where it benefits you and your people, right? Or do you set up new systems out here, independent from, the corruption in some sense, right? So that's interesting right there. I mean, once you have a majority of brown populations, there's something to think about, whether you want to replace the system or just change the system, you know, or just even set up your own systems, right? So that's the challenge right there. But yeah, we got to be aware of this, decolonization. It's a lot of implications there. In that article, decolonization as a metaphor, it just says it's just talk, right? It's just a metaphor for most people out here. it's just talk, right? That's all you hear, right? There's no action, right? There's no action in dismantling the system of white supremacy and privilege, right? You know, the challenge for white folks is to give up the resources and land back to the brown indigenous people, right? All the stolen wealth and resources. But they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. They're too comfortable on this land, right? Benefiting from what their ancestors did, you know? And I keep hearing white folks coming out and they keep saying, "Oh, um, I actually been coming across a lot of this. Um, some of them in some of the conspiracy communities, and some of them. I even saw a YouTube video of this white guy. He goes on the reservations interviewing Native Americans, and he actually challenged one of them, even like a medicine man, a revolutionary one who was part of the American Indian movement. And as he was interviewing, he snuck in a question. He goes, "Oh, so what happens with me? Like, I didn't enslave your people. I didn't commit genocide. What happens to me? Like, those were my ancestors that did all that, right? Why do I have to pay for everything that they did, right?" And the Lakota man said that, "Oh, we could coexist, right?" But I would go further and challenge. If that guy interviewed me, I would challenge him. I said, wait a minute. That's not true what you just actually said. You should be held accountable for colonization because you're a descendant of settlers, right? You're a descendant of slave masters, right? Of colonizers, thieves, right? And guess what? You benefited from it. You're right here on indigenous land, right? Even just you even talking on this land and you know making income off this land, right? Having privilege, right? Even you even questioning a native, right? That's settler colonialism right there, right? I would challenge him and say, if you're truly sorry for what your ancestors did and you're truly just, and righteous in some sense, and you believe in cosmic justice, well, guess what? You have a lot to work, a lot of work, because your people have set up a system of oppression, colonialism, where your people benefit most, right? We have a government, an economic system, right? A lot of things that was established here by your ancestors, right? And still maintained by you and your people, right? So the task for you is to go beyond, apologies, right? And take action and dismantle the system of white supremacy, colonization, and also give up your resources, give them back to the indigenous people, right? Pay them off, right? You know, what about our reparations, right? Give the land back, right? There's been some white people though that bought land and gave it to back to indigenous people, or gave up some of the land that they inherited from their um, their ancestors who were thieves, and they gave it back to indigenous people. So there's some righteous white people out there, right? There are some righteous white people, but not enough of them. Not enough of them. So the implications of land back, it's very challenging to all the foreigners here on this land, right? You know, remember indigenous people were here first, right? And this is their ancestral land. They They've been here for thousands of years. This is you too, Chicanos, Mexicans. That's why it's important when you start taking up that Latino Hispanic identity, you can't say that this is your ancestral land, right? You're now identifying as a colonizer, as a European. So it's important to know yourself and know who you are, know your ancestral history, your ancestral ties to this land, right? There's a lot of history on these lands, you know, with brown people, indigenous people, right? And so this is how they confuse you. They confuse you with that whole mestizaje. They say, oh, you're not really indigenous. You're mestizo, right? You're half European, right? They confuse you. And they do that on purpose so you won't identify as indigenous and you won't demand land back, right? Seriously, you won't challenge the European colonizer because you see yourself as a colonizer. You identify with Cortez, right? There's actually a good article a friend of mine wrote on the whole critique of mestizaje. His name was Victor Mejia, and he says it's confusion. You identify as the colonizer and the colonized, right? You identify with, you know, the Spaniard and the indigenous. You don't know where you stand. You're confused, right? That's why he actually said it's important to identify as indigenous, right? Before 1492, we were our history starts way before 1492. It didn't start at 1492. It didn't start at the rape of our ancestors, right? Our history goes way back, right? So we can say this has always been indigenous land, but if you identify as mestizo, you're saying you're not indigenous. And I know this is true because there's I remember seeing a documentary on the whole Zapatista movement, right? The whole EZLN movement, where there was these indigenous looking Mexicans, right, who were being paid off by the government to fight against the Zapatistas who were fighting for their land, right, and sovereignty, right, because the government was trying to take the land away from them, right? And they interviewed some of these guys in the military, right? Some of these guys who were against the EZLN and Zapatista, and they look very indigenous, right? And they asked them, "Are you indigenous?" And they go, "No, soy mestizo, no soy indio," right? So they confused you, right? And these guys are indigenous. They have a what they say a nopal on their forehead, you know, very indigenous. Yet they're going at war with each other because of this confusion, right? And this is part of the confusion and problem out here, you know. Colonialism is deep. Colonial is very deep. I actually saw another video I was watching yesterday where this white guy goes to Mexico City and throughout Mexico, and he's actually learning Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the Mexicas, right? And he learned some of it, and he's going to Mexico City, and he wants to find a community that speaks Nahuatl, right? And he's going around to all these indigenous looking people out here, and none of them know how to speak Nahuatl, right? Most of them is speaking Spanish, right? And he does come across some that know other native languages, you know, from say the Mayan regions, but hardly anybody knew Nahuatl, right? But he did come across a danzante who knew it. But he said the danzante was interviewed, and he says he doesn't get to practice Nahuatl that much. He grew up speaking it, right? But because nobody hardly speaks now, what they're all speaking Spanish now, and there is a community in Mexico that does speak Nahuatl, and they speak both Spanish and Nahuatl, right? But it's a small community, right? And I was actually thinking, wait a minute, if Mexico nationalized indigenous languages, you would see more Mexicans speaking their indigenous languages. Why don't they change it, right? Instead of making everybody speak Spanish, right? Why don't they make it a requirement for people to, like in high school, in elementary, junior high, college, to know Nahuatl or in other indigenous languages in Mexico, right? Maintain the indigenous languages, revitalize them, right? And even make it a requirement for commerce, for business, right? For transactions, all that. Because that's very important. I found out that a lot of people speak Chinese because of business, right? They go and learn a language because of business, right? They go and learn Spanish or English because of business, right? Well, make it a requirement in Mexico, right? To speak, say, indigenous languages for business, right? You got to institutionalize this, right? Make it part of the system. This is how you keep, you get more people to speak indigenous languages. But no, the system there is very white supremacist and Eurocentric, and they enforce Spanish, right? Just like out here in the United States, I'm speaking English. English is the official language, the European language, right? I should be speaking my native languages fluently, right? I've actually educated myself in learning some Nahuatl, right? Um, but you have to keep it going, keep practicing, or else you'll forget, you'll lose it, right? And this is their plan, to erase indigenous history and identity away, erase indigenous languages, right? You know, and um, and this is part of the settler colonialism, their institutions, their systems, right? Everything has to be European, right? Everything has to be Eurocentric. So we got this problem is systemic white supremacy, colonialism. So I think, a lot of us brown people start, when we start getting status and resources, start working on re-indigenizing. Decolonization is almost impossible, right? Maybe we can't decolonize everything, I say, but maybe we can decolonize some aspects, right, of colonialism. Maybe we can decolonize mentally, right, from white supremacy, right? But even that article, decolonization as metaphor, even challenged that. So, white people, they want to decolonize their mind, right? Or even people of color, right? But they still occupy these lands, right? Europeans, right? They still have these lands. They're still settler colonialists, right? Ancestral, their ants, their their offsprings from their settler colonial, occupiers, right? And they're still occupiers, right? So, decolonization is pretty deep, and it challenges a lot of things out here. Um, so, I think re-indigenizing is more realistic. And I do see some projects out here, especially in the Chicano Mexican community, where they're getting people to learn their indigenous languages, right? There's some communities like that teaching Nahuatl language, right? I've seen some teaching Yoeme, my ancestral Yaqui language too, you know. And we have to not only teach this in high, was it not only in the institutions, say the university level, but I think it should be taught elementary, junior high, high school, and even for free, or maybe some donations or something, but out in the community, right? Because instructors do deserve to be paid as well. So can't be in poverty all the time, right? Especially if you're doing a job. Um, but definitely, we should have more projects of re-indigenizing, teaching our people our history, our culture, identity, our languages, right? And even getting into entrepreneurship, right? Empowering the community. I actually heard a dansante, guy that I know from East LA. He was talking about brown entrepreneurship. I think he actually saw my video on that. But he's always identified as a pochsteca, right? Was it a person that trades, right? That's what they call it in Nahuatl, right? So someone that trades is it's kind of like a business person, right? And interesting, he said that entrepreneurship and business, we were all about that back in the day, right? We had our tianguis, we were trading food and products and doing a lot of things like that. This is how we had our own um, economic system. It did have like, was it a barter system in some sense? We would trade and all that, and we, you know, we we as indigenous people were not as much in poverty as we are now under the colonial settler state. Oh, and that article is really interesting because the decolonization as metaphor, it talks about the settler state, and I was like, wow, it's like it's even like questioning even the status of the settler state. Very interesting. But we definitely need to even get into brown entrepreneurship, start supporting our own communities, our own businesses, start, start promoting that, start getting into that, you know. And once our people start getting lots of wealth, start buying more land, right? And buying some lands too, and you know, make it even for the communities, right? Buy land and set up your gardens, organic gardens, and have set up your buildings to have teachers and people, professors and all that, and researchers and activists getting involved and teaching our people, right? Getting them, empowering them, right? Community centers, right? I remember a lot of times when Mexicans, Chicanos out here try doing community centers, it just like doesn't last long, right? And because you need funding, right? It takes money to do that, right? So this is part of the problem is that we don't have a lot of money out here in our brown communities. Most of the wealth is the Europeans, right? The colonizers. So, but we got to also promote community empowerment, right? And health and wellness and consciousness, and start teaching our people our history and culture. That's what it's all about. Brown entrepreneurship. We got to get out of that poverty mindset too. You know, we have to be the owners of our own production, right? That's what it is. So decolonization, I see some of it happening already, right? We have the brown populations increasing. We're starting to see more brown folks getting status. They're not just cooks nowadays or farm workers or maids. Now, the descendants of those people are now getting educated and they're becoming involved. They're gaining more status in society. The only question is that a lot of times people get educated and they become Eurocentric. They don't help their communities. They forget about their communities. They go live with white people and they say, oh, I don't want to live in the ghetto, right? Or they don't want to make a change, right? And I understand, the ghetto can be tough, right? It can be very violent, you know, but, you can live wherever you want, right? But my thing is that you definitely need to go back to your community and help them, and empower them, teach them how to get out of poverty, right? Um, Teaching brown entrepreneurship, go out and mentor brown folks, right? You know, educate them, right? You know, definitely. Anyways, decolonization, is it possible? Is it possible to get our land back, right? And to get our resources back? We could do it little by little, incrementally, right? It's not impossible, right? We can do it little by little. It may take generations, right? But at the same time, we have to either change the system or create systems of our own, right? And I know in the health and freedom movement, they're already doing this kind of stuff, but guess who's doing alternative systems now? It's white people, right? These white liberals or these white independents, right? They even see something wrong with their government, especially with all the mandates and lockdowns. But they're creating their what's called freedom cells and their whole little communities and everything. But the problem is they're still settlers, right? They're still descendants of settlers and colonialists, right? They're still occupying the land. But I think the task for brown folks is very similar. We need to create our own infrastructures, our own systems out here, alternative systems, right? You know, so it's almost like even what the Chinese and Japanese did, right? And it's like they saw the Americans like, with their highly advanced technology and economic wealth. So, and they say, okay, we're gonna copy them and become as powerful and wealthy as them. So that's what they did, right? Um, Brown folks, and I mean, Asians created an alternative system, their own systems. Now they're competing, right? China has the biggest system, like, they're like United States sees them as like, oh, they're the biggest competitor right now, right? And the Chinese people have a lot of history and a lot of strength, right? I just don't agree with the way they run their government, right? Kind of like Big Brother, and they're on this whole globalist agenda, right? But I think brown folks should start doing something similar, but not just being not becoming corrupt as the Europeans, right? Because even the Chinese and Japanese kind of embrace Western lifestyles, and they're even being colonized in some sense. They embrace the whole industrialization. You see the air in China is very polluted, right? The Japanese, and they're now embracing Western lifestyles. A lot of the older Japanese men are complaining that all these new Japanese are becoming very feminine. The guys are becoming very feminine. They're becoming very non-binary in some sense, and uh, there's no traditionalism hardly valued these days. And a lot of Japanese are now embracing a lot of American junk food, so they're coming out with a lot of health problems. So as brown folks, we can get inspiration on creating alternative systems like that, but we don't have to be following the white man's ways and his corruption. So we don't have to be having an unhealthy lifestyle. I think going back to our roots, our indigenous roots, we have a wealth of knowledge and ways to learn and to revitalize, right? And even create these alternative systems out here. to empower ourselves, right? So we just have to tap into our ancestral creativity, our historical creativity, and revitalize that. And even go further, not just be stuck in the past, right? We can innovate and create, right? And and empower ourselves financially and holistically, right? So decolonization is it's very complex, right? But it's possible. It's possible. But anyways, I guess I'm gonna end it here. Let's see here. I guess I'll respond to some comments. I see casual conversation. Made some comments. Let's see here. If anybody else is watching here, feel free to send some questions too or comments. Let's see here. Let's see. I guess here. I guess so. We can't say this was indigenous land. Yes, we can. If you identify as indigenous, you can definitely, whether you identify or not with indigenous, it must be admitted that this is all indigenous land. But all brown people out here are indigenous. We have indigenous history and ancestry, so we have a right to claim to this land. Um, and is that by genetics or self belief? So I'm not too sure what the comment was about, but genetically we are indigenous as well. Oh, and speaking of that, oh, that article, go check it out on Google. It's called Decolonization as Metaphor. So it's even the European colonizers who used the whole blood quantum and genetics there too to try to push on native people and to push them off their land, right? And so it's funny that they use the one drop rule for African Americans. Oh, if you have one drop of African blood, you're black, right? You're African. But they didn't do that with natives because that would threaten them, right? Because a lot of natives would, claim their land, so they wanted to erase indigenous people, and they wanted to push this whole blood quantum and genetics on people so they can say, oh, guess what? You have very little indigenous blood in you, so you don't have a right to your land, so we can go and take your land and buy it off, right? And indigenous people to this very day in the reservations are still having problems with that, where even their BIA governments on the reservations are opening the land that belonged to the tribe, and they're allowing foreigners, usually of European descent, buying off their land, right? And little by little, they're still taking their land. But then we have the issue of white people claiming to be indigenous. They have a long, long, great, 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 great uh, Indian princess, right, as an ancestor. We had people like that article talks about all that. Talks about like what's her name, Elizabeth Warren claiming to be indigenous. We have some of these, these white people claiming to be indigenous, but most of their ancestry has been European descendants, right? And it's not the same with Mexicans. If you actually look back and try to look for a European relative, uh, sometimes it's like way in the past, right? Distant, right? Some even can't even trace their Spanish ancestor, right? Um, I say, that doesn't apply to Mexicans. Most of us have a majority of, I would say, indigenous ancestry. Actually, one of the biggest populations of statistics, native populations is Mexicans, right? In Mexico. And they tried using the whole mestizo term to recategorize indigenous people, even if they were full blood, right? Yeah, and so they say, oh, if you speak Spanish, you're a mestizo, you're no longer indigenous, and they could be full blood, right? But like I said, like the whole mestizaje been made to de-Indianize us, to make us not identify as indigenous. And my thing is like, even if you have some Spaniard blood in you, you still have a right to claim to be indigenous. You know, you can identify as that and identify with this land. You are no longer immigrants, right? You are no longer a settler, right? You know, you have ancestral ties to this land, right? But it's kind of different with the white people out here because they mix mostly with themselves, with whites, you know. So that's a big issue, you know. Like, okay, should we allow the one drop rule universally? And that means there's actually more indigenous people than what we actually think, right? And it's not just belief. It's you know, it's just it's genetics, it's blood quantums and all that. And even just you can find out your ancestry. Just you know, just even look at yourself in the mirror. And I noticed the difference. I've actually met Spaniards straight from Spain, and they look different from most of them look different from Mexicans. They have a different, distinct look, but a lot of times Mexicans want to identify as Spaniard, right? But I've seen the Spaniards; they really look white. A lot of them, you know. And I met these Spaniards, and I seen that they have different, like even the way they look and all that. Phenotype is superficial, but it's all about genetics, as they say, right? But you still see that there's physical differences between someone who comes straight from Spain and say a Mexican or Chicano. You know, you'll see even with even the lightest skin, the lightest Mexican out here, Chicano, they still don't look like a Spaniard straight from Spain. Uh, it's because they have indigenous in them, most likely the majority, and that's why they come out with different features and phenotypes. So just let you know, just don't don't be confused and identify as something that's not indigenous. You have a right to lay claim to this land, and Mexicans have indigenous ancestry that is all connected throughout this, throughout the Americas. You find connections with Canada, with the United States, Mexico, Central America. We're all related here, all of us indigenous people. We're not foreigners, right? They don't fall into the whole thing, oh, my ancestors were immigrants or I'm an immigrant, right? No, your people have always been here for thousands of years, right? Guess who's the foreigner immigrant? The European colonizer. Anyways, let's see here. Oh, okay. So I kind of went ahead on this. So I just mentioned that what's the relationship between indigenous and, well, they're all indigenous, right? Actually, you can learn a lot when you study anthropology, and you'll find out that Mexicans have cultural and and there's even a genetic trail. There was this one lady doing some genetic research, and she was doing a genetic trail throughout the Americas, right? And they're all related. All these natives, they make you think, oh no, we're separate and distinct, and you know, we're totally unrelated. That's not true. There's even genetic ties of all indigenous people here, and so um, just not only with genetics, right? If you study anthropology and archaeology, you'll find out that Mexicans and Native Americans out here in the United States, oh, very, they're brothers and sisters. That's what it is. There's archaeological evidence of the Anasazis traveling to Mexico City, right? They say a lot of the people in Mesoamerica may have actually did, not may, but they did have ties and connections and cultural relations to the Anasazis out here in the Southwest. And they say the Anasazis are actually the mother culture of all the Southwest Native Americans out here. So there's your evidence there, right there. Also, there's Hopi oral tradition of natives traveling, and very similar to the oral tradition of the Mexicas. The Mexicas coming out Chicomosto, where the caves were, right, and traveling down to Mexico, where it's called Mexico City, right. Well, the Hopis have very similar oral tradition, right, and it talks about their people traveling down over there to Mexico. Um, and that's not the only thing. If you study the what's called the Uto-Aztecan languages, right? They're all related. Nahuatl was a trade language of trade. It was a big language in Mexico prior to colonization. A lot of even what you call Mexican Spanish comprises of Nahuatl words. Uh, you know, you have words like chicle, um, chocolate, chocolate, chocolate. I mean, there's so many words that you can find that in Spanish, Mexican Spanish, that has Nahuatl, right? Nahuatl influence. Um, the Uto-Aztecan languages, you can find that family tree includes the Nahuatl language, Yoeme, the Yaqui language, and a whole lot of other languages too. They're all related, and they go from like the Southwest to Mexico and all the way to Central America too. Even Central Americans. I remember I come across a guy. He says he was pipil. I know him. He's from East LA. He says, "Yeah, well, our people speak Nahuatl too." I'm like, "Oh wow, interesting." So we have connections throughout the United States and the Americas, right? Not just only the language, but even the food. There's a guy named one of my professors in the past. Name was Dr. Sinkley. He says, "Follow the corn." Who's the one that actually genetically modified the corn from a Dale Seatley to the corn, right? Um, the you know, and so you follow the corn. That's where the people went, right? And some Eurocentric anthropologists will try to say, "Oh no, the people didn't travel with the corn," but Dr. Seatley and me would disagree and say, "No, people traveled with the corn as well. How do you think they traded it, right?" It's not absolutely the case that people travel with the corn all the time, but I would say a lot of times they do travel with the corn in order to trade it, right? Trade it at the tianguis and different places, right? And the corn went all over the Americas, right? Imagine that. You can find it in Canada, the United States, Mexico, Central America, even South America. And guess who created the corn, genetically modified it? It was us, Mexican, indigenous. There's a whole story, an oral tradition about that, right? So not just the corn, but other foods, right? What they call the Mesoamerican staple. I think is beans, corn, squash, and what was the other one? I forgot what exactly, but the major foods that we ate, or you find a lot of Native Americans eat the same thing out here, right? So that means we're 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 relatives, right? And not only that, you have the mounds. You'll find mounds in the United States. Mounds are those kind of like temples made out of hills, right? You'll find that in the United States, and they say also that the indigenous of Mexico created their temples off these kind of mound type structures. Um, you know, so there's a lot of relations there. There was travel. We traveled with canoes, all the Gulf of Mexico, all that culture around there, Florida, the Caribbean, all that, Mexico. We all traveled around there. You find even some Puerto Ricans, some Tainos that have very similar words that are found in native Mexican languages like Nahuatl and stuff. So I came across some Tainos that talk about that some of their words. I'm like, wow, we have that word too. So it's not. It's also the East Coast, even the South, even the West, and all that. There's a lot of evidence that we travel back and forth, right? We're the same people. We may have eventually, created different tribes and different nations. People think a tribe and nation is just one absolute little tribe and they had nothing to do with anybody else. That's not true. People join tribes, other tribes merge with each other and form other tribes, right? Like in Mexico, we had people think that we're just completely tribal, right? We did have tribes, eventually, and then they merged and formed into what's called Calpulis, right? And Calpulis were bigger, like kind of like a bigger nation, and then they merged. These Calpulis got together and formed confederacies, very similar to the Iroquois Confederacy out here in the United States. You had different nations, right? Forming and having alliances, right? The Mexicas had alliances with other nations too. So so are all indigenous people in Mexico tribal? No, not all of them. Some of us went beyond the tribal hunter-gatherer stage and became agricultural, right? Some native people remain tribal, right? And it's not to say that they were inferior. Actually, I find out that the hunter-gatherer tribal lifestyle may have been even healthier than the agricultural lifestyle because the corn, even though it helped people survive and everything, like the genetically modified corn, um, it's it's not always good to eat a lot of that because you know um, you have to put it through a process, right? In indigenous traditions, a process to make the food, to make it healthier, right? But it's not to say agricultural systems or hunter-gatherer stage are inferior or superior. Um, I think they all, serve their purpose, right? Some argue agricultural civilizations, you know, allowed more people to live longer in some sense. Um, but there's debates on that. But either way, our people had either, our people had a huge civilization. We are also tribal as well as agricultural. And to this very day, we still have tribal communities out here, especially in Mexico. Even out here in Los Angeles, if you really think about it, all these brown communities, we're all kind of like our own tribes, right? We live amongst different indigenous people out here. We have Central Americans, Mexicans, right? We have Mayans, we have Native Americans, we have Chicanos out here. We're all kind of have this whole our own little community. So you can see even the barrios out here, kind of like the reservation, right? And and so we're all still living amongst each other and having relations with each other, and we got to see is that we are the indigenous people, whether we live in the cities or the suburbs, on the ranch, countryside, and all that. Just look around. There's brown folks everywhere. We got to stop thinking that indigenous people are only on the reservations. There's reservations everywhere, whether you call it the the ghettos, the barrios, the projects, or just working class communities out here. You know, uh, we go to similar things. Colonization, right? Anyways, it's just being self-aware and being realizing, you know, our people and everything. Realizing that we're still here. We didn't become extinct. Uh, but anyways, I guess I'm gonna end it here. Thanks for your questions, casual conversation. Um, Decolonizing is very complex, right? And it can happen little by little increments. Go check out that article, Decolonization as Metaphor. Google it. Very insightful information, and it goes into the complexities of decolonization. I get into a lot of decolonization philosophy and theology as well. Indigenization, more in the sense, contextualization, indigenization. Um, so if you guys need some more resources, remember, you have my details below. Contact me on Instagram. Send me a message. You want a book list or some resources, or you want that article, I'll send you the link. And don't forget, go on my Rumble accounts. Go check out those videos. There's some good videos on there that challenge the mainstream, uncensored knowledge. And also join me on Twitter too. I have uncensored conscious chats on Twitter. Go make a Twitter account. You can join me uncensored, where I talk about even deeper issues out here. uh, Anyways, well, you guys have a good day, and whatever you do, don't be woke, be conscious. All right, see you later.